started. Okay, well, where are we in this process we're at? We're nearing toward the end of the first module. Our focus in this module has been on just studying and preaching epistles, and with many of the things we talked about will apply to the other genres as well, as you'll see when we get to the next module, which is on narratives. So here we're in module 1, we're approaching the last few sessions together, and our focus now is really on the sermon itself, and has been the last several sessions. Tonight, my desire, Lord willing, is to talk about sermon manuscript and the preaching event itself. And we're going to get some of your feedback and input as we go through that together. Here, of course, there's all our steps that we've been going through together, and now we're finally getting toward the end, writing the full manuscript. But before we get to that, I just want to quickly survey where we've been the last few weeks. Of course, you'll remember in writing out the sermon, we want to remember the objective of the sermon. What is our goal? And that objective is, again, being accurate. That's the primary concern that we have. That's why we put the study in, and being clear. It's great that we know what it means, but it's actually also very important that that our hearers know what the passage means. So we need to be clear. It's very important, and then applicable, meaning how do I help my hearers respond? What do I do? And then finally, engaging or passionate, why it matters, and being engaging with my hearers, because it's one thing for me to be impacted by the passage, but I think that excitement, that conviction that comes from our own study, that comes from how the text impacts us, needs to come across to those that are listening, so that they understand this passage is important, that this passage matters. We would hope that anytime we open the Bible, that those listening would have that passion in their heart, want to understand and respond, but that's not always the case, is it? Sometimes we need to help them in that process by how we approach in our teaching. We'll talk more about that when we get to sermon delivery. Not only do we need to understand the goal or the objective of the sermon, but also its structure. We spent a lot of time looking at the structure, because that's what will help us be clear. If there's structure to the message, it's easier for people to follow us. And as I was in the preaching lab with the guys this week and listening to all the sermons, that's one thing that I noticed. Some of the guys, it was very hard to follow them because they weren't clear. They didn't have that much structure to their message. So we kind of had to review a lot of the steps of the structure. But the guys that did have the outline points, that did a good job of going through them, it was easy to follow, and they did a really good job. So clarity really comes from having a structure that can be followed. Now, we have to be careful that we're not boring in that structure, but that's another skill that the preacher needs. But there does need to be a structure that people can track, can follow, so they're able to understand what you're saying. All right, so the structure of the sermon, and as we've talked about, the basic structure is there's an introduction, there's the body of the sermon, and a conclusion. And I won't go through all of these in great detail since we spent time on them in the past. I'm just doing this just to stir your minds by way of reminder. But just remember, the introduction needs to get the attention, surface a need in the hearers, direct them to the text. If you're moving from where they're at, you want to bring them to the passage so they're thinking about the topic of the passage. And then you might want to give some of the background context of the passage only as it is helpful to your message. All right.
That's full too.
Yeah. So I noticed a lot of guys were in the preaching lab that I just was in Pakistan. A lot of the guys felt like they had to give the whole background to the book they were preaching, and that really isn't necessary, except maybe at the beginning if you're just starting in a book. As you go through it, just describe things in the background that would be helpful to your passage. So, for example, we're studying Colossians. You guys have been given passage in Colossians. So if you're in a passage that's talking about a particular false teaching that they were dealing with, then you might want to bring that into the background context and talk a little bit about the false teaching that the Colossians faced. But you don't need to bring in all the geography and all the, Colossians was founded in 29 BC and all of that. That's interesting, but keep it focused on what is going to be helpful for them to understand of the background in the passage you're dealing with. So that's what, when I talk about introduce the background context, don't make it a long history lesson about the book, or else it will not, that won't be as helpful. So you want to just bring in the information that'll be helpful for them to understand the passage you're in. Okay, that's the idea there. And then transitioning to the body of the sermon. That's one thing very, very important, guys. When you're preaching, make sure you clearly state the main point of the passage. As you get to the end of the introduction, as you read the text, summarize the main idea from that for them, and then so that they can see, okay, this is the main idea, and then transition smoothly into the body of the sermon. All right, that's something very important for people to be able to follow you. And as you get to the body of the sermon, again, as we've discussed, the 6 P's: the point, the proof, the picture, the persuasion, the plan, and the problem. Those are all elements that you want to consider for each outline point, to make sure you state the point accurately and clearly. Again, a lot of guys don't do that. They'll just start talking about the point, but they won't state the point. And that makes it harder to follow you, especially as you get further on into the sermon. So it's very important that you state your point clearly, excuse me, and explicitly. And then the proof is explaining that point. What does it mean? Show me from the text. Bring me to the passage. So that's the explanation. And then the picture is illustrating that point, either to help it be clearer, to give an understanding, or to give emphasis, or help to make a particular truth memorable. And then you also want to remember, you're not a preacher if you're not seeking to persuade. So the stating the proof and the point and the proof, that's the teaching element that needs to be in your sermon, as well as illustration. The argumentation or persuasion, that's the preaching element. That's when you begin to move them to try to persuade them to respond, and then give them through the application some ways that they can consider in how to respond. And then sometimes it's helpful to discuss a question or a problem, a doctrinal issue that the passage addresses. All right. Now, as I mentioned to you in the last class that we had, of these 6 P's, definitely you should incorporate the point and the proof in your sermon, as well as the persuasion. Those 3 are requirements. Okay, you have to state the point, you have to explain it, and then you have to, as a preacher of Christ, seek to convince or persuade your hearers. The illustration, application, the question, those will be at what you think will be helpful. Sometimes it's good to have an illustration. Sometimes, though, it's not necessary. The point may be very clear enough, and you just want to focus on that application. Sometimes you may decide, not to have application in that point, that you'll bring some application in later. That's perfectly fine. Those will be at your discretion. But definitely you must state the point, prove the point, and seek to persuade. Okay. And finally, of course, the conclusion of the message. And this is where I think a lot of us kind of just end the sermon. We don't consider the importance of coming back to and restating the main point, maybe stating it in a different way, having something like a story, a quote, a song, a time of reflection, just something where you're bringing the sermon to a close, but you're not just ending it. You're bringing it to a conclusion where they are again being given a moment to refocus on the main idea, to consider the importance of it, how it applies to them. And I think a story or something like that is often very helpful to seal the sermon, rather than just say you're dismissed, or you just close in prayer and it ends. So you really want to land the plane smoothly, so to speak. Okay. So those are all just the introduction, the body, the conclusion. We've spent a lot of time on that. Now, a sermon manuscript. I wanted to talk a little bit about this. I know some people are inclined to want to write out a full manuscript. Others don't do that. Maybe just after their study, just put a few notes together. I know some guys that don't even do that. They study the passage, and then they just go into the pulpit on Sunday, and then they have in their mind the structure of the sermon, perhaps, but they didn't write anything out, or wrote very little out. So I want to talk about tonight just the importance of writing a sermon manuscript. Now, again, I'm not talking about what you bring in the pulpit. That's a different discussion that we'll talk about a little later. What I'm discussing here is just the process of, after you've done your study, writing the sermon manuscript out, writing a full manuscript out. And so as we consider that, I wanted to open up the question to you guys. Is I want to talk about what are some of the advantages of doing that, and maybe what are some of the disadvantages or challenges of doing that. So let me open it to you guys and ask you, what do you think some advantages to writing out a full manuscript might be? And again, I'm not talking about what you bring in the pulpit. I'm just talking about the preparation for the sermon. What you bring in the pulpit, we'll discuss a little later in the class. All right. But so my question I'm throwing out to you guys, what are some advantages potentially for writing out the sermon in full? Anybody want to have any suggestions?
Maybe we we will stay on the text. We will not go astray from the
Yeah, well,
text.
good. It can keep us on point, especially if you bring your notes with you in the pulpit. Help to keep you from, I'll say, wandering in the message. All right. Anybody else? Again, just in writing out the sermon, full manuscript, what might be some other advantages to doing that? Anybody?
You wouldn't get lost.
Won't get lost?
Yeah.
Yeah, similar point. You won't get lost in the sermon wilderness, we'll call it, right? What else? Some advantages to writing out the sermon beforehand.
So we can look back or think back what we have been teaching, or maybe our congregation also can benefit from the writing script.
Yeah, in what way could they benefit?
For example, without writing the script, and then we just hear, oh, well, last week or last year, our pastor said or taught this thing, but we forget the text and the underlying fact or the biblical, the teaching of the biblical principle. So it's really difficult to recall what have been taught. So writing the manuscript help us to remember what has been taught.
Yeah, that's good. So a lot of times people will ask me, for a copy of the sermon. Some people, sometimes that I preach to, they have trouble following. They have some challenges with concentration, perhaps. So they say that they like to read the sermon because that helps them to better understand. So then if you write out a full sermon manuscript, you have something to give them. So that's also helpful. And I know even during the pandemic, some brothers in the Philippines they weren't able to meet together, of course, and they didn't have Zoom or internet capability. So they would write out the manuscript basically, and then go, and send it, give it physically to the members of the congregation. So they had at least something to help them in understanding the text. So good. Any other advantages to writing the manuscript ahead of time, full manuscript? Anybody else have any thoughts?
So, Pastor Tim, one thing is, if we have written the full manuscript as a church, then we can compile the whole years of teaching and preaching.
Yeah, I know a lot of guys will do that. They'll actually put the sermons together and either write a book or write like a Bible study manual, or they'll use those notes for the future. They'll use those messages for the future to help people, especially when they've preached through a whole book. Now you have a resource for your hearers. And this is something for you guys to really think about, is if you write out your manuscript, in Burmese or Mandarin, or something like that, and you'll have some material that you can use later on. For example, I think Tongin, you wrote a Ephesians commentary, right? Was it Ephesians, Tongin, that you wrote? So yeah, if you were teaching through Ephesians or Colossians or Thessalonians or something, and you're writing your manuscripts as you go through the book, once you finish, you actually sort of have a commentary in your own language that you can use as a resource. So that can be very helpful, very valuable. All right, good. Any other advantages to writing a manuscript ahead of time?
It helps with the clarity of the message. Like as I write it out, I get to see how I present the point. So sometimes I have to rewrite until it is clear.
Good. I think that's a really, really important one. For me, it's one of the most helpful, one of the main reasons I write out the manuscript, because again, my goal is to be clear. Okay, I want to be clear. And so when you write something down, and then what I do is read it out loud before I preach it. I'll read through my manuscript, because there's something about hearing it that helps you. At least it helps me as I read through it. I go, well, that doesn't sound right, or that doesn't sound very clear. And so it allows me to reword it or to add more things or to edit things so that it's more clear. So to me, that's a huge advantage of writing out the sermon ahead of time. You can think about what you want to say and how you want to say it. And so, again, I'm not talking about what you bring in the pulpit. I'm not saying read it in the pulpit, okay? What I'm talking about is in the preparation before you're preaching. I found it to be extremely helpful to write out what I would like to say and then to read that out loud. Yeah, it takes more time, but for me anyway, it's been very helpful to with the clarity, right? You know, because as you write something down, you know, in your mind you're reading it, but how does it sound when it's out loud? Because it may make sense to you when it's written on the page, but when it's spoken out loud, it may not seem as clear. All right, so so that's a big reason I would encourage you to write out a full manuscript, so that one, you can think about what you want to say, but also two, you have something you can read aloud to see if it sounds, makes sense, if it's clear to you. So something to consider. Any other comment on that, or any other advantages that you see, with potential advantages with writing out a manuscript ahead of time? Anybody?
I think I think when we write our preparation, we can add more. I mean, but I think we may not the same, right? We have different kinds of our potential. So I think, for example, for me, when I write, I can add or many ideas come, something like that.
Yeah.
So that is for me like a blessing. But the sad point is sometimes I'm lazy to write. But
All right, we have an honest preacher. Yeah, actually, when you write things out, it can get you to think about, you get other ideas as you do that. Things that can come to mind, that your mind is being stirred up as you're writing down the message. And as you're doing that, yeah, sometimes things pop into your head, or you consider that that can be helpful. And that happens to me as I'm writing out the manuscript. Okay, good. These are really good. Anybody else? Anyone else have anything that they would like to add as far as advantages? Tangen, did you have another one?
one more I think for personally is it we can remember long time. I mean, for example, when we write it down carefully and maybe 3 or 5 months later, we still can remember what we have written. So it will, yeah.
Yeah, that's good. If you write something down, and then, like for me, I also read it out loud, it does help me to remember, so that when I go into the pulpit, or when I teach, that a lot of times there's much of it I can remember just because I've written it out, I've read it, and I've thought about it. So again, this isn't that we should be tied to our notes in preaching. I think that's another discussion that we're going to have later, but writing out the sermon at least allows my mind to think about the message and to know where I'm going, as well as I write out the full sermon. So those are all really helpful. I have put much of what you've said, I've already is here. These are things, my thoughts, but you guys brought up most of these things. So message will be, if you write it out in full beforehand, it'll be easier to remember, helps you to think about what you want to say. I think it encourages discipline in the process, because sometimes when we studied a passage, we can kind of like, okay, I'm finally done. But I think sometimes in writing out the full manuscript, it really forces you, like, for example, if you're, you know, you have your outline in your mind, say, so you know the points that you have, and as you're explaining a particular point, if you write everything down, it really forces you to bring what you studied to the message and really think about, okay, am I explaining this text? Am I explaining this point enough? Am I clear on this explanation? But if you don't write it down and you're just preaching, you're just thinking about the explanation as you preach, sometimes you're not going to bring into the explanation all that is needed to help your hearers understand you. Does that make sense? If you don't think ahead of time how you want to explain a particular verse, then a lot of times that may not come to you at the moment you're preaching. But if you've written it down ahead of time, you've thought through how you want to explain a particular point, I think that's really helpful. Now, whether or not you bring all of that into the pulpit, you may, as you write something out, decide, you know, I don't need to explain all of this. I think just this part is enough to explain this text. So writing it all out doesn't mean that's everything you have to say on Sunday morning. All right, that it's just this is the preparation step. This isn't the actual preaching step. So it's just the preparation step to help you be as effective as possible, as clear as possible when you bring the message. Okay, I just want to emphasize that point. We're not talking about the actual preaching event. We're just talking about what is most helpful to prepare me to be effective when I preach. So writing out a full manuscript, I think, really contributes to that. It also allows you as the expositor to think about illustration and application. All right. Again, some folks are really good at that in the preaching moment. Things come to their mind, but I'm not. So writing out a full manuscript then forces me to think about illustration and application ahead of time, so I can come up with perhaps a very helpful illustration related to the passage or application. So full manuscripts help me with that process. Also, as I do a full manuscript, it allows me to consider my hearers when I write it out. I can think about, spend some time focusing on, okay, how would this message directly apply to my congregation, to those listening to me? So I can think about application. As we've already mentioned, having a full manuscript gives you a written copy that you can give to others or use to prepare a book or use to prepare a future study. Or if you're going to preach at another church and they ask you, if you have a full manuscript, you have something that you can already be prepared to preach elsewhere. At least you'll have all of everything written out, so you can reduce your preparation time. So this has been very helpful for me, because I preach at a lot of churches, and sometimes I just don't have time to prepare totally new messages. And so I can use things that I've preached elsewhere because I have the full manuscript. I can then take that, and then it reduces the amount of time to study in preparation for the preaching at the other church. And so, I'll still go through it and study, but I don't have to spend as much time. Now, if I don't have a full manuscript, and let's say I'm teaching a passage that I preached on, 8 years ago, I'm not going to remember much, myself anyway. maybe you guys have much better memories, but so it's really, really helpful for me to have that full manuscript. And as I read through it, and I have my study notes that I've written down, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I remember. So that's something to keep in mind. It's a real helpful resource. Okay, any other advantages that you guys could see that we haven't talked about in writing a full manuscript, again, in preparation ahead of time for the sermon? Anybody? Okay. Well, let's talk about what are some of the disadvantages, or what can be some of the challenges in writing a full manuscript. Again, I'm not talking about what you bring in the pulpit, I'm talking about in the preparation process. Are there any disadvantages or maybe negatives to writing out a full manuscript? Anybody?
I think it consumes lots and lots of time.
That's the big one, right? That takes,
Yeah,
maybe we should say lots
writing. Yeah,
and
because
lots
writing.
of time.
Yeah, rewrite. Yeah, choosing the grammar, choosing the expression, choosing the word. Yeah,
Yeah, you're right. This
yeah,
is the biggest disadvantage. It just requires a lot of extra time in preparation. So yeah, sometimes in my sermon preparation, maybe even 20% or 25% of the time I'm spending on writing out the manuscript and rewriting it and reading it. So that's a big disadvantage, a big challenge that we have. But again, you know, clarity is important. So the way I look at it is, this is what will help me be the most clear if I take the time to do this. So I have to be very disciplined in the whole study process, in the time that I put in, and I know how much time it's going to take me. I have to make sure that I put that in my schedule in preparation. And that's just part of, you have to plan ahead. And if you realize, you know what, it's going to take me, you know, 4 hours or 6 hours to do the manuscript and to practice, then I have to put that time in my schedule. And but yeah, this is probably the biggest challenge or disadvantage. Any others that come to your mind?
Hinders extemporaneous way of preaching because you tend to, I mean, for me, yeah, I need to guard against relying on my manuscript too much.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. So if we prepare a full manuscript, then the temptation is, well, you bring that with you into the pulpit, and if you do that, it can hinder your ability to be engaging when you preach. And so I want to talk about that when we get to the actual. Actually, we'll talk about it, Lord willing, a little later tonight. The style, different forms of preaching, but yeah, having a full manuscript can then be a big temptation. I bring a full manuscript with me in the pulpit, but I don't read it. I don't use it, but it's a helpful guide for me, just the way I use it. But it is a temptation to just keep your nose down, looking at your notes the whole time if you bring that with you. So that's a disadvantage in having a full manuscript. But I know a lot of guys that we will discuss this when we look at pulpit notes later, who they'll write out the full manuscript, but then what they bring with them in the pulpit is just an outline or a simple form. They don't bring the whole manuscript with them. They just bring a few notes. But they've written out the full manuscript, so that's helped them prepare in their mind what they want to say, but they just bring a much reduced version in the pulpit with them. So that's an option that people do. Any other disadvantages in writing out the full manuscript, again, in preparation for the message? Anybody? Again, I think, as Pastor Philip said, I think the big one is the time commitment. That's one of the biggest challenges. Now, there is a step I'll show you that it doesn't take as much time. I call it basically writing a sermon draft that actually we'll talk about here in just a moment. This is a way maybe to reduce the time. It won't have all the full advantages of a complete sermon manuscript, but it won't take you as much time. I think it's still to your advantage to write out the full manuscript, again, because it allows you to think through the whole sermon, how it is structured, how you want to explain certain points, how you want to illustrate or apply, the persuasion. Again, if you have a full manuscript, you might realize, oh, I didn't really focus on persuasion in this point. I need to do that. So writing it all out will help you to see things maybe that you missed. So I think it's very helpful. Now, how do I do that? Some of us, it's very difficult to write. We have what's that thing called, the writer's block, where you sit down and you try to write something and it just nothing comes to mind. And so you just feel stuck. Nothing's coming. One thing I found to be very helpful for me when I experience that, or if I don't have as much time to write out a full manuscript, is I call it the bullet point manuscript, or maybe a sermon draft. All right. And this has been a helpful tool for me as I'm putting the sermon together, because I understand the structure of the sermon. I need the introduction, I need the body of the sermon. In the body of the sermon, I have the 6 P's, then there's the conclusion. But actually putting those things together can be a challenge. And so sometimes I'll do what I call this bullet point manuscript. So let me show you what I mean by that. And I'm not saying you have to do this. This is just an idea. And maybe for some of you, it might be helpful. All right. Especially if you have trouble writing. So let me just use Matthew 28 as our example. We know this passage. We've talked about it before. And so here I've got, again, that Jesus said, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore, make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you. Lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. So that's a great commission, of course. And after study, found the homiletical point, the homiletical idea. The main point is make the master's mission your mission. All right. And then we had the 3 outline points: to embrace his authority, execute his assignment, to be encouraged by his assurance. All right. So let's say this is the homiletical idea that you put together. You have your main point, you have your outline. Now you're like, okay, and this is critical to have this, the main point and the outline, because those are the bones. That's the structure of your message. Now it's like, okay, how do I fill this in? How do I put together the full sermon from this? Well, here, let me show you an idea, what I call the bullet point manuscript. And that is simply this. What it is kind of where you brainstorm ideas. Okay. When we talk about bullet points, that just means, you come up with just short thoughts or ideas. And since for example, okay, I know my introduction, I need to get the attention of my hearers. I need to direct them to the topic. I need to consider the background context. I need to surface the need. Those elements, right? And so a bullet point manuscript is just, okay, let me just come up with a few ideas. All right, I need to get their attention. Okay, so this passage is the Great Commission. So it's talking about making disciples. What is something that I can use to get their attention? Maybe a story about a special military mission, a special ops mission where they had to rescue some guy. And so it's like their mission, and so they're focused on this mission, and it's the most important thing. It's their priority. So, right, that could be a story that can help your people start thinking about mission, right? Because again, my main sermon point is make my master's mission your mission. So, or you may come up with sometimes, to get the attention, you may want to tell the story that the passage is found in. So you may say, you know what, I'm just going to tell them the story from Matthew 28, and start with Jesus appeared to them, and he told them when he appeared to them to go to Galilee and wait for him. So you might use that as an introduction. So it's just what ideas come to your mind to get the attention of your hearers. Okay, so let me just show you. And again, right now it's just ideas. You're not committed to these for your sermon, but I know that in my introduction, an effective introduction gets their attention. So I just want to come up with a few ideas. I don't write it all out, but I just come up with the idea. So maybe a story of a special ops mission, or I might tell the background of Matthew 28, or I might talk about the importance of a person's last words. Maybe there's a story of a relative or a famous person, and what were their last words before they died. Well, here, the Great Commission is these are the last words of Matthew's gospel. So these are the last words that Matthew wants to leave us with. So maybe a story about someone's last words. Okay, so these are just three ideas that came to my mind, and I'm not going to give all of these in the sermon, but these are just ideas as I'm thinking about, and in the sermon I'll just pick one. Okay, I really think the special ops mission will work well with the sermon, so I'm going to do that one. But at this, and we're just in the preparation step, we're just thinking of ideas. All right, so that's why I noticed they're bullet points. All right, this is the bullet point manuscript where I just come up with some ideas, and then later I'll say, okay, this is the one I want to use for my sermon. All right, and then the same thing. Okay, I know my introduction needs to surface a need with the hearers, so I'll think about, okay, what are some ways I can surface the need? There's a lot of issues today with churches who don't focus on the gospel anymore. They don't focus on evangelism or making disciples. They focus on other things. So that would be good for me to talk about. Or I might think about asking them questions about what is the purpose of the church? What do you think Christ wants us to focus on more than anything else? What's our goal or our role as a believer? What should we be concerned with or focused on? So again, these are just some ideas that I come up with. I'm not going to do all of this in the sermon, but these are a few ideas to help me think about, and I might think about later, okay, this is what I'm going to do for the sermon. Okay. Now the background context, I'm going to think about what are a few ideas there of the background that I would want to include in the introduction. And then how do I want to transition to the passage? And then of course I remind myself of the main point. So if you can see all of this here, this is just bullet point ideas for my introduction. Okay, I didn't write out a full introduction yet. I just came up with some ideas, and then when I do the full, and when I write it out, I might just focus on these that I'm highlighting. Okay, I may just pick one. But the point here is just come up with ideas, because again, sometimes it can be difficult to just start writing. So I want to think about a few ideas that will really help me, and then I can come back later and actually write those ideas out. All right. Are there any Any questions on this? Does this make sense? Again, I'm not saying this is something you have to do. I'm just giving this as a suggestion. It might be helpful for some of you, especially those of us who it's more of a challenge to start writing something out. This sort of, I think Tungin mentioned earlier, you know, getting the mind to think about things. And so this is one way to do that. Just break it down into smaller pieces. So instead of thinking about, oh, I got to write out this whole sermon and how am I going to do that? Where do I start? And what should I say? And how? Well, let's just start with the introduction and then just start with the small piece. Okay, first I need to get their attention. Okay, let me think about that. What are some ways I can do that from this passage? All right. And then just to the next part. Okay, these are some ideas to get their attention. How do I surface the need? What are some things I can say that might help them see the importance of this passage for them or why this matters? So then I just think about a few ideas there. That's the point. So I'm breaking it down into smaller pieces and just thinking of ideas, brainstorming for each of those pieces, right? That can make the task a little bit easier or less challenging than thinking of the whole sermon I've got to write out, okay? Questions or comments about this?
Yeah, a lot of good ideas there, a lot of good suggestions. The first one that pops into my head is that I struggled with making, you know, a message and then spending all the time on the introduction. Never getting to,
Yeah.
yeah, that's always a problem. The introduction usually gets in the way. Again, the idea, of course, of doing verse by verse, reading it over and over and over again, and then gathering material that, of course, expands it, that fires you up, you know, and gives you direction and gives you something that really is important to your own life first. If it isn't important to you, it's definitely not going to move anybody else.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a complex thing, and it's definitely we need to pray about it. And the thing that helps me the most is getting into rest homes, getting into hospitals or whatever, doing a lot of personal work and just a lot of, like the prison, preaching and preaching 2 hours, you know, and just forgetting yourself. Then definitely we're always thinking about, oh dear, what are they thinking about this? You know, are they happy with what I'm saying? Do I sound right? You got to get over that. It's got nothing to do with us. We got to get to the point where we're invisible. And the message is everything.
Yeah.
And of course, like MacArthur says over and over again, the gospel has to be there. The gospel has to be the foundation. We've got to be careful we don't, you know, get all wrapped up in secondary things. And especially this introduction. This introduction is my enemy. I have to really be careful about that because I've got all kinds of ways to get people's attention. And I forget about what, you know, I'm really there for. I've got their attention, but we never get to the meat of it. And oh my, the time is so short. You know, when you're up there, it just flies.
Oh, I know.
And so, especially when you're enjoying yourself and you're, you know, you're of course flying. But yeah, that. Well, anyway, it's a challenge.
Yeah,
And
you bring
something
up
to pray
a
about. Yeah, it's a
great
challenge.
point. Yeah, a couple great points from what you were saying. I think first, just a reminder of prayer, you know, so before we dive into writing the manuscript, definitely pray once again, just for the Lord's guidance. And then also too, I think you make a good point about the introduction is that I have seen very much is a lot of time is spent on the introduction. Once in a while, that's okay, because maybe the topic is of great importance and you're trying to convince your hearers of the importance of it, or but really the introduction is just that, introduce. It's like, you know, when you're meeting somebody, you know, in the introduction, you know, hello, your name, and but you don't spend the whole time just on the introduction, right? That's just the part that opens the door. for you to have interaction. And it's the same in the sermon. And so I appreciate you saying that, Dwayne. The introduction is just meant to introduce. It's not the main event. And so that is a challenge, because sometimes you may come up with a really good story or something to get their attention, and you get into the story and you start preaching the story. Or I see a lot of times guys will start preaching the text in the introduction. So they'll introduce the topic, and then they just start sort of going on into the passage. And instead of waiting, it's like, okay, no, you're just introducing right now. So, but sometimes they're, so excited about the text that they just kind of start preaching. And so, or they preach their introduction. I've seen guys do that, where they maybe use another story from the Bible somewhere else, and they just start preaching that story and instead of their text. So, when we talked about introductions before, I said my goal in the introduction is 3 to 5 minutes, and no more than 5 minutes. Again, once in a while I'll go longer if I think it's necessary or important. Even, maybe it's the first message from that book. You might want to have a longer introduction, or like it may be a very important topic that you really want to get people to think about the significance of it. Or, but generally speaking, introductions should only be, in my opinion, 3 to 5 minutes, because you're just introducing. You're just getting their attention and moving them to the passage. And so I think this is another reason writing it out can be helpful, because if you write it out and you realize, wow, this is becoming pretty long, I need to reduce this. So that's one advantage to writing out the full manuscript. It really can help you with gauging your time. It's because if you have a full manuscript and a third of it is your introduction, you realize, okay, I got to reduce my introduction here. I don't need it to be this long. So great points. So this bullet point manuscript is just really meant to get us started thinking about ideas for the different elements or components of the sermon. So for the introduction, as I said, these are just some ideas for each of the key elements in the introduction. Now, once you've done that, then it's like, okay, now I got to move to the body of my sermon. Let me think of some ideas for that. Okay. And I only do this for the first point on our example here, just to give you an idea. I didn't do it for every point. But so, for example, again, going back to, here's my sermon main point of this passage. Here's my outline. The first outline point is embrace his authority, right? From verse 18, all authority has been given to me in heaven and earth. So as I'm preaching this text, I want to come up with now my bullet point manuscript. I'm just coming up with ideas. Now, again, remember, I've got the 6 P's. Okay, these are my guide. So as I'm doing that, my first P is point. Okay, well, state the point. Well, that one's easy. All right. Now, proof. Now, what am I going to include in my explanation? So here in this step, I'm just putting ideas. Okay, I think I need to explain the word authority. All right, that's important for this point, that they understand what is authority. What does he mean by that? And then I also want to talk about the scope of his authority, that he mentions both heaven and earth. And then I want to indicate that has been that the heaven and earth modifies heaven and earth modifies authority, not has been given. So it's describing the authority in heaven and in earth, not that he's been given authority in heaven and earth. So and then I might want to identify several other passages that describe his authority. So these, again, I'm not necessarily going to have all of this in my explanation, but these are just some ideas that I want to include under proof or explanation. Again, remember, proof is the explanation part. What do I want to explain to them, instruct them? The picture, here I might just come up with, okay, what are some illustrations that I could use? And again, I'm just brainstorming. So I might come up with one idea is, a soldier obeying his orders without question. And that might connect me to the introduction. If I use the story about the special ops military mission, you know, this might be a good illustration to use in that first point, connecting to that theme. Or I might go back to Daniel 7. It pictures Christ receiving authority from the Father. All right. So these are just some ideas for this first point. Again, I won't be, and I may come up with a few others about authority. Maybe, you know, talking about the authority of a government leader or something. I don't know, but just coming up with ideas. And then later I may pick one. Okay, I think this will be the best illustration to use for this particular point. And then I think about persuasion. Again, that's the argumentation step. This is where, okay, what am I going to do or say to try to persuade them about the point of this passage? All right, so these are some questions I came up with in my mind as I thought about this. So here again, notice we're just going through this in our minds step by step. So you're not writing out everything yet. You're just coming up with ideas. And then that's why I broke this down in each point having these 6 P's or 6 elements. And you can think about each one separately and just come up with ideas. And again, you won't be including all of these in your sermon, but this is just a way to get your mind thinking about in a more structured way of what you might want to include in the message, all right, in this bullet point manuscript example. So under persuasion, I'll have a few ideas. Then under plan, in this case, I only thought of one idea, but there may be some other specific application that you can use. Maybe memorize this passage to remind of Christ's authority or something like that. So there are different, again, you're just coming up with some ideas. And then problem, you know, maybe as you're thinking about this passage, you think, now some people may wonder if Jesus is God, how did he not have authority already? So what is this about the Son of God being given authority? Isn't he God? So this might be a question that you want to address in this point, because some people may be thinking about that. So we might need to talk a little bit about the incarnation, and that when he became a man, Jesus humbled himself, it says in Philippians, right? And so it says that he did not exercise his prerogative as God. It doesn't mean he no longer became God. He's still divine, but he did not, it says he did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped in Philippians. And so there were some things that Jesus set aside for a time while on earth. And so this would be an opportunity perhaps to talk about the incarnation, to discuss a little bit of theology if you feel that's important. All right. You don't have to do this, but this is just you as the pastor or the teacher deciding whether or not your hearers that this is important for your congregation. Okay. But by doing this, guys, as you think about each of the 6, doing this bullet point manuscript then really forces us to think about each of those 6 P's and come up with ideas for them. And we may not include all of that in the sermon, but the point here is that it makes us think about ahead of time and come up with possibilities for the message, okay? So this is just one example. I didn't do all 3 points. We have the other outline points here. Execute his assignment and be encouraged. So I didn't write it out for this example, but I would for a full bullet point manuscript. I would just come up with the same thing. I would just think about ideas for each point. Now, doing this whole process, you might be able to get, it might take you an hour or you know, or so to come up with, go through the whole sermon doing this. All right. So I think this can be a very helpful exercise for you in preparing the message, because it's often difficult just to start writing out a full manuscript. This is a sort of a step before that to to help you and get your mind thinking about it and breaking it down so it's easier to, you're not thinking about the whole message. You can just focus on each piece one at a time and then come up with ideas yourself. So, and then sometimes guys will do this and then, you know, they may not have time to do the full manuscript, but at least they've thought about each part of the sermon and they can use this to work with in their sermon. This some guys I know just do a bullet point manuscript and then bring that into the pulpit with them. They don't write out the full manuscript, or they may write out the full manuscript, but they don't want to bring that in the pulpit with them, so they just bring in their bullet point manuscript with them. All right, so that's something to consider. All right. Again, I'm not saying this is a required step, but it could be a very helpful one for you in the process. All right. And then finally, of course, we have the conclusion, and it's the same thing. I know the elements or the components of my conclusion, right, is to help my hearers remember the point. So I might summarize the main point by taking them to 2 Corinthians 5, for example, as far as making a connection to the main point, or restating the sermon concept or sermon main point and outline. Then I know the conclusion. It's good to direct my hearers to action. So I had a few questions here that I came up with that I thought would be helpful in the conclusion. And then landing the plane. So I thought of some possible stories that I could use at the end of the sermon, or give time of silent prayer for asking them how to make his mission our mission. Or maybe example of someone in a different country who gave his life for the gospel, or there's all kinds of, so just, these are just ideas how I might want to end this message. Okay. Or I may come back with return to the special ops mission that I mentioned in the introduction. You know, as we've discussed, sometimes it can be very effective if you, in your introduction, maybe give a story that introduces the topic, but you don't finish the story. You wait till the conclusion and finish the story. That can be very effective in your sermon, bringing it all together. So again, these are just ideas that I come up with, and then maybe I decided later, okay, this is the one I want to use for this particular message. But again, it's just coming up with bullet point ideas for each of the components or elements of the conclusion. All right. So what I've tried to do here, and this is why I spent so much time on the structure of the sermon, is that if you know each of the elements or parts of the sermon, you can break it down in this way just to come up with ideas for these different parts. All right, so it's not just this one big, okay, I got to come up with this one big message. I can actually think about each component or each part of the message and just focus on that and come up with ideas. All right, and then all together, I now have ideas for the entire sermon, and I can decide what I want to include in the actual message. Okay, so sometimes I'll do this. I'll take an hour and just come up with ideas and brainstorm, and then from this, I'll write my full manuscript. And this can help me a lot, especially sometimes when I just stuck and I'm not sure. I'm not sure what to have include in the message. Okay. Any questions on that? Hopefully it makes sense. Just an idea that you may find helpful. Sometimes I don't do a bullet point manuscript. You know, sometimes it just sort of, and the more experience you get, you know, sometimes it just comes to you. You don't need to do this, but there have been several times where I'm just stuck and I'm not sure. I can't get started. So I just start doing this bullet points and it gets my mind going. And can be very helpful. So yeah, pray, and then just maybe come up with, go through the bullet point manuscript, and that might help you to get things moving in your mind as to what to say. All right. And like I said as well, it'll help you to remember to address each part of the sermon. So you'll think about all 6 P's for each point. Even if you don't use them all, at least it'll help you to be thinking about each of them. All right. And two, also something Dwayne mentioned earlier, the centrality of the gospel. A lot of times too, this is a big advantage for me in writing out the manuscript, is that I go back to the manuscript and I say, okay, did I present the gospel here anywhere? And sometimes I'll realize, oh, I didn't incorporate the gospel in this message, or I didn't incorporate it clearly enough. And you want to put it at the right place too, not just always throw it down at the end. Oftentimes there are many places within the sermon itself that would be a great time to bring in the gospel that's connected to some particular point. So writing out the manuscript helps me to then go back and make sure that I've done that I've included the gospel within the sermon at an effective time in the sermon. All right. So that's another advantage actually to writing out the sermon manuscript ahead of time. All right. Any questions or comments? Okay. Well, I hope that helped stir some ideas for you. Hope that was helpful.
Tim,
Yes.
how about the length of your manuscript? How many pages do you normally write?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. And I think another advantage of the writing a full manuscript is you can gauge. I know how many words, roughly how many words in my full manuscript, what that means as far as how long my sermon will be. So for me, if I have 6,000 words in my full manuscript, that's going to be a 55-minute sermon, 50 minutes. So if I have 5,000 words, I know that's going to be a 40-minute sermon. If I have 3,000 words, that's going to be 25 or 30-minute sermon. So as you get more experience, so when I write out a full manuscript and I have 8,000 words, I know, okay, I got to cut this down. It's going to be too long. So that's a way for me to measure or gauge how long my sermon's going to be. Now, when I first started preaching, my full manuscripts were a lot longer because I relied more on them, I confess. So it was like 7,200 words or 7,400 words. But now I know I have to be under 6,000 words because I add more, I do more extemporaneous. So I have a gauge though that tells me how long my message will be. So for me, yeah, 6,000 words, somewhere in there is, I don't know how many pages that is. I use 14 size font so I could see it more easily. I'll probably need to go to larger font as I get older, but so yeah, 14 size font, 6,000 words. That's about 13 pages, something like that. But everyone's different. Like I said, that's just for me. I know now, and as time goes on, there'll be even fewer words because I know that I'm going to even add more stuff as I'm preaching than what's on my manuscript.
Any counsel for beginners or for those who are new to expository preaching. Is that a better way to start with maybe half an hour type of sermon? Not too
Oh.
long.
Yeah, I mean, so you're talking about what's a good sermon length
Yeah, for beginner.
yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I recommend beginners to start off with half an hour, and then find out how the listeners cope with his preaching. And I think for beginners, I think it's very important for them to have feedback on their preaching. Yeah, that's some of my thoughts.
Yeah, that's good. Anybody else have any thoughts or ideas about that?
Yes, Pastor Joshua just make the point that not only for the beginners, for the preacher, but also for our congregation, those who are not familiar with expository preaching, that is also another problem, because my previous church, when I first introduced this expository preaching, so our preaching were, and in many churches still going the same, so many elaboration stories and current issues, and we are used to listening those things, and just exposited preaching, then the expository preacher got the critic as, oh, you are not preaching and make exhortation, just teaching, and we are sitting like in a Bible school or something like that.
Yep.
So yeah, Pastor Joshua, you make a good point. Yes. So, well, first of all, I think maybe 25 minutes, 30 minutes, both for the preacher, beginner, and then for the new congregation. I
Yeah.
mean, new means for expository. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's not just beginning preachers, but yeah, if your hearers are not used to it. I remember I started a midweek service at a ministry in Hollywood for people who were drug addicts or coming out of prison, or homeless families, or prostitutes, people coming off the street and trying to get their life, back. So this ministry gave them a place to live and to try to get a job or education and it was good gospel ministry. So I started a midweek service there. And so these people, most of them had not sat through a sermon, in their life. Okay. So I couldn't do like an hour-long expository, message. I mean, they'd be like, right. So I had to train them to listen to a sermon. So I started at 20 minutes. And even then, some of them were like, oh, this is, painful, but after about 6 months, we actually were doing like 45 minutes, and they were all attentive, sometimes even longer. So that was a case where, if I went longer than 20 minutes at the beginning, then they're all asleep. So it's not helping them, right? So I'm just preaching to the wall at that point. So I had to really train them to be able to listen. So they got used to not just the length, but kind of, how to how I went through the message. I explained the passage and illustrated and all that. So, but yeah, they were able to, in 6 months time or so, go from 20 minutes to 45 minutes. And that's usually, I think 45, 50 minutes is probably long enough, because at some point, people can't absorb much more, especially, we're explaining a text, there's going to be a lot of instruction. And so, keep that in mind. And yes, preachers that are beginning, oftentimes as well, it may be better to consider start shorter and just, grow into the longer message. But yeah, and I think you also, Pastor Philip, mentioned another good point. I know Dwayne likes to bring this up too. So I think it's very helpful to remember, we want to be engaging, and it's not just a lecture, right? We are explaining, we are teaching, but we have to remember that the preaching element, and then even in our teaching, we're explaining so they understand, and we're not just giving them information. We want them to understand because we want them to respond. And so important that we remember the persuasion element of it. And I think it's also, Dwayne, you've mentioned several times too, is this is why it's important that you're looking at your hearers, because sometimes you may realize, after 30 minutes, they're not really with you anymore. Maybe they're tired or whatever. So, at that point, it may be good to just say, okay, let's end here and we'll continue next week. But you want to be able to see, kind of make sure that folks are with you as well. So those are some things to consider. Any other thoughts? It's a good point that you guys brought up. Any other comments?
I would highly recommend that you get involved with children. You learn in a hurry that lecture is very limited, and a sermon, unfortunately, is too close to a lecture, and you're definitely going to have problems with a lecture. So if you're working with children's church, or you're working with Sunday school, or VBS and things like that, that's all we did through college, and then for the most part, even in Singapore and India, we had children. And boy, you got to have a lot of energy for that, and you've got about a 3 or 4 minute attention span, and so you've got to I suppose be conscious of that, so that you keep them with you. And that means object lessons, that means pictures. And so, the big people are almost the same. So you have to plan to be interesting. You have to plan to, I suppose, bring in maybe verbal object lessons. But it don't take much effort to be boring. It's really easy. But you really, you've got to be innovative. Yeah, and especially with kids, and that's good practice. If you can manage kid and be successful there, you're okay. You're going to be all right. But you got to have energy.
Yeah.
Starts with you.
Yeah.
You don't have energy, and you don't have intensity, and you're kind of, you're obviously bored. That you don't want to communicate. I mean, you're excited about what you're talking about. This is the fire, and you don't start until you get the fire, or you don't start an outline until you're really excited. I back in school collected a lot of things that were from England. They were dumping all their Christian books in the 70s in the States, and I picked up a lot of stuff that was really worthless. And so I gave it away, but there was a few things that, and Spurgeon was excellent. Last night, Cindy and I listened to a message, it was audio, by Spurgeon. And that was pretty neat. Of course, it's rewritten. It isn't the King's English anymore, but he was a natural. and he had a gift. And of course, we need to isolate what our gifts are, and then really zero in on our gifts. Then there's other things we got to develop. So this thing is, this business of making disciples. We're not making converts. The Lord does that, but we're making disciples. And so we've got to have meat, and we've got to have intensity, and we've got to have energy. And I don't know, it's a challenge. That's something to pray about. Boy, it sure is. But yeah, we're all a bit different. And so what works for one of us is not going to work for another. But I've really struggled. I'm really, I suppose, hopeless with all this. But well, I haven't, he doesn't give up, because this is a calling. You can't give up. And I'm so glad the Lord let me get old, because it gives me more time to practice. And boy, right now I'm writing on the Son of God, and that's really challenging. The only begotten Son and all this. That is to me new territory. I always try to get into new territory. The old stuff that I've kind of understood, we'll just leave that behind and get into new territory. And boy, this business of Jesus, the Son of God, and then we are adopted in as sons. This relational aspect of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and now us. Boy, that's exciting. And that's all 1 John chapter 3. We are already the sons of God, but it doesn't yet appear what we will be, but we're going to be just like him. Boy, I tell you, we've got a bright future. Now, if that don't, fire you up, I don't know, then you've got a problem. But yeah, we've got to get fired up. And oh boy, the Bible is, it's just timeless truth upon timeless truth. It's just so fascinating, so absolutely exciting. Oh, well, okay, I better stop again.
No, that's really good. I think that your suggestion of teaching children, I think is spot on. I found that to be helpful for me. Actually, too, I teaching a seniors ministry. No offense, Dwayne, but teaching. I taught several times in the seniors home, because they had a Sunday service, so we would teach there. But that was a challenge, keeping people's attention there as well. So, and then even this ministry I mentioned to you about in Hollywood, people weren't used to sitting still listening to a sermon, so I had to learn how to keep their attention. I think we presume a lot, that people are, I'm going to open the Bible, people are just going to listen. And it should be that way, right? But it isn't. So that's why you'd see Jesus, all that they would always use words like behold, or listen, or pay attention, take heed, be careful. They use these terms to kind of grab the attention, because they realize, right, that sometimes people drift and they need to be brought back. So yeah, these are all, I think, really good suggestions to consider. I think
practice slamming the pulpit.
It's not too hard, because you need to keep it for the future.
You've got to do something. I don't know what you do, but you've got to be innovative to really, I suppose, wake them up every once in a while. It just, I like to slam the pulpit. Oh, that gets results. And just give it a good hit, but you got to have a reason to hit it. But that's a good idea. I don't know what else you can do. Maybe take your shoe off. That would probably get them. Or I don't know. Well, what would you do, Brother Tim, to really break up the whole deadpan audience?
Yeah, that's good. I think sometimes we can lull people to sleep by not varying our own voice, our tone, our volume, our pace.
Shouting,
sometimes we get in sort of this flat mode where we're just at the same So, yeah, change if you've been speaking softly, yeah, that's, a loud noise. Some people that they talk very intensely at a high volume, they need to lower it down. That'll get people their attention. So, yeah, I think just sort of reading the congregation, right? Sometimes moving around. People get you if you start walking towards the congregation, that gets people's attention. Because uh-oh, he's coming near me. Uh-oh. Yeah. So I found that to be helpful or effective. And sometimes just you stop and say, hey, everybody, you with me? You with me? Just sort of breaking. And usually that gets, unless they're so far gone, sometimes there's nothing you can do. But I think I want to be careful I'm not theatrical, though. I saw one guy, he did, he slammed the pulpit so hard he broke the pulpit. He, that actually did get our attention. But he hit one side of it and it was loose and it broke it. It was like a piece of wood on the top and he hit it and the wood flew off. And there was a water cup on it too. So that flew off too. So he did get our attention. But people are like, oh, they were a little bit shocked by that. And then now he had nowhere to set his Bible afterwards. So, that. But yeah, I mean, there are things that are helpful to do. We just want to be careful we don't overdo it. And then that in itself becomes a distraction. I had one guy just sort of yell real loud, clap his hands like, hey, and it would kind of scare people. And then they're just sort of, they're sort of, what's the word? Just on edge, from that. And they're not listening because they were so scared. So there's a balance. One preacher told me he jumped up on the piano to get their attention. And he said that didn't go well. So, but yeah, I found sometimes just stopping and saying, hey, everybody, you with me? Or something like that. That usually is a break that people respond to. Okay, let's see. Let me just bring this to a conclusion here. So once you finish the bullet point manuscript, if you've done it, you can put the full manuscript together. And again, that full manuscript doesn't have to have everything from your bullet point manuscript. The bullet point manuscript is simply to help stir your mind to come up with ideas. And then you can take that and then write out those ideas which you think will be most effective in putting the full manuscript together. Now, some people, they like to write out the body of the sermon first and then come back and write the introduction once they've done the body of the sermon, because once they've written out what they want to say from the text, then they go back and do the introduction because they know what they're going to say in the body. But I start with the introduction. That usually for me gets my mind moving. There's no written rule on this, just whatever will help you be most effective. But again, the full manuscript is just an opportunity to be able to think through everything you want to say, have an idea of how long the message will be, remind you of the important elements to make sure you have in the message, and it will really help you think through what you want to include so that you can be the most clear. Okay. Now, next week, as we get together, we'll talk about then, okay, as I go from that full manuscript, what do I bring with me into the pulpit? So I want to talk about maybe that thought process. And some guys that say, oh, no notes, don't bring any notes in the pulpit, you bring notes in the pulpit, you are in sin, brother. Some people have that attitude. Others say, you know, you need to have the full manuscript there so that you don't miss anything. There's differing opinions. So what I'd like to do is just talk about that. Well, what should go into that decision, and what are some of those elements? So, Lord willing, that's the plan for next week as we gather together. Okay. All right. Well, I hope this session was practical, gave you some ideas to consider. I want to just, any last questions or comments before we end the day today? Anybody have anything else?
How's the Pakistan